Hello. Okay, so in part two, we're going to have a look at what factors might make some cabinets under some prime ministers really powerful and really influential, and what factors and stuff might make some cabinets a lot weaker against a prime minister. And therefore, obviously, if you've got a powerful cabinet, that might suggest that those prime ministers are perhaps adhering more to cabinet government, and obviously, if you've got quite a weak cabinet, then obviously that suggests more prime ministerial type of governments. So we'll look at weak cabinets first of all. So I think one factor, probably the most important factor actually, I would suggest, which can lead to either strong cabinets or weak cabinets, is the relative power of the prime minister himself or herself. If you've got a prime minister who is powerful, I don't know, they may have a big majority, for example, or be personally popular in the public, or and to be fair, to have a big majority, that's probably a given as well. Or perhaps a strong personality or a strong kind of agenda. That can lead to quite a weak cabinet because that kind of prime minister might be able to kind of subdue, I suppose, a particular cabinet. And if they've got quite a lot of confidence in what they want to do and their ability to achieve it, then again, the cabinet might be seen as being less important. I would suggest for strong prime ministers of recent times, Mrs. Thatcher springs to mind. Tony Blair does as well, or at least up until the Iraq War, perhaps a bit less after that. Boris Johnson, arguably from 2019 through the COVID pandemic, again up until about Christmas 2021, January 2022, when the whole Partygate engulfed him. And for these prime ministers, you've got prime ministers with quite strong personalities who had quite big majorities, seen as being electorally popular, and all three of them have kind of been accused, especially Blair and Thatcher, have been really accused of kind of sidelining their cabinet, ignoring their cabinet, being accused of being like presidential, I suppose, as opposed to using cabinet government. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, she was often characterised in things like Spitting Image and satire of having a handbag and kind of ignoring cabinet ministers. But as we said, that can lead to some kind of disasters. So when Michael Heseltine resigned and walked out of the cabinet, that was quite damaging. She also lost her Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, in 1989, which then really led to her downfall 12 months later. So a strong Prime Minister still has to be a bit careful and wary of their cabinet. Tony Blair as well, obviously he's been quite a strong Prime Minister, decisions not always being made in Cabinet or very cursive debates. So the decision, for example, to give the Bank of England independence seems to have been made just by Blair and Brown and with no real Cabinet decision. The Millennium Dome, very similar, very short discussion which seems to have taken place. Cabinet meetings being quite short, which again suggests not a great deal of discussion. All suggests a weak cabinet and a strong Prime Minister. You also might get cabinets who are made up of people who are not going to challenge the Prime Minister. And again, this often might be due to having a strong Prime Minister themselves. There have been some criticisms, for example, of Liz Truss and her cabinet that she chose people who basically agreed with her. They agreed with her radical economic policy, so Kwasi Kwarteng, for example, or were very strong Brexiteers. Boris Johnson as well was accused of that after 2019, of choosing cabinet ministers of people who perhaps weren't going to challenge him, who kind of shared largely his kind of Brexit and economic view. And therefore they're able to do things without having to fear many cabinet disputes. Mrs. Thatcher tried to appoint people who shared her view as well into the cabinet, the so-called dry ministers, so people like Norman Tebbit, for example, Nigel Lawson as well. So you do sometimes get cabinets who might be seen as being quite weak because they're made up of people who are not willing to challenge the Prime Minister. There may actually be a lot of ministers who might be quite new in the job as well. And again, you know, they might not feel comfortable in challenging a Prime Minister if they're fairly new. And so that could be a factor as well. And as I said, I think an issue which can lead to weak cabinets is if they don't discuss or debate key issues. And again, that's largely down to the Prime Minister themselves. But as we pointed out, that can also lead to disaster as well if cabinets don't do that. That said, you do sometimes get cabinets which are quite strong and would suggest that cabinet government is not dead. And conversely, that seems to occur largely when you've got a weak prime minister. Weak because they're unpopular, or weak because they've got a very small majority or a very divided government, something like that. So John Major springs to mind, Theresa May springs to mind. And arguably David Cameron, because obviously he had that, it's a bit of an unusual circumstance, isn't it? But he had that coalition with the Liberal Democrats. So he always had to be quite consensual and perhaps deal with cabinets, deal with those Liberal Democrats in there. So, for example, looking at some weak prime ministers, obviously you had Theresa May. She had to rely on her cabinet, really, especially after the 2017 election when she lost that majority, to try and get things through. And you saw a number of her cabinet who resigned over her Brexit deal, which really then brought about her downfall. You've also seen, for example, arguably under Liz Truss as well, obviously a fairly weak prime minister following the economic crash. She then had to appoint Jeremy Hunt as her Chancellor, who basically trashed her economic policy on the first day. Okay, let me just... Okay, sorry about that. I had a charging issue on the laptop. Okay, so I was just saying about how Liz Truss was forced to have Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor, who basically then reversed all her economic policy. Again, a very weak Prime Minister up against a minister with a very different direction. She was forced to have him, really, wasn't she? Sometimes a Prime Minister may find through no choice that they've got to have powerful ministers in their cabinet. Prime Ministers sometimes have to try and get all the factions of their party in the cabinet, and so some of them may have people, so-called big beasts, in their cabinet who can prevent a prime minister from doing things, or can challenge a prime minister, or make life difficult for them. Gordon Brown, who was Tony Blair's Chancellor, springs to mind, and how he's very keen to always ensure there are lots of so-called Brownites within the government, and they were sometimes a challenge to the prime minister. He had to have Robin Cook as well, who was a bit of a prickly character in his first cabinet, and then he resigned over the Iraq War. As we said before, some prime ministers prefer to actually work with their cabinets. Their preferred style may be down to personality or maybe down to circumstances. So, for example, David Cameron seemed to prefer to delegate to his cabinet and allow them to get on with stuff. For example, Michael Gove basically redid the whole education policy this way. I think that was partly down to Cameron's style, but also I think the coalition kind of suited that, because you have to kind of delegate when you've been weakened in that way and having to work with a different party. So again, that can be a factor. John Major as well tried to appear very different to Mrs Thatcher and appeared very consensual. And again, the cabinet seemed more influential and more powerful in that way. And that was clearly shown that occasion when he actually said on TV once, the bastards in the cabinet. He didn't mean to say it. He thought the thing had ended, the actual interview, which kind of showed his frustration that he had. And of course, this all fits into this idea of unity as well within the cabinet. And sometimes you get cabinets which are quite divided. Again, it often coincides with like rocky periods for a government, or prime ministers who are perhaps not that strong. Divisions can occur, which can then lead to arguments, etc., etc. Again, there's a little bit under Liz Truss, wasn't there, when Suella Braverman resigned as Home Secretary. She was clearly unhappy with some policies there, and she went, and then also been reinstated again by Sunak. Theresa May, her cabinet was really between Remain and Leave people, with people like Boris Johnson on the Leave side, and then they all left the government. And this leads to a final point about the cabinet, actually, is that it does, in some ways, a prime minister is actually often reliant to stay in power on their cabinet. When Boris Johnson went last year, you may have noticed he lost all those junior ministers, but he was clinging on. It's only when he lost two cabinet members, Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid, that he was forced to throw in the towel. Mrs Thatcher as well. Great unhappiness within her government about her style in that final 12 months. but she only went once the cabinet turned against her and basically forced her out, which again would suggest that ultimately, even against a strong Prime Minister like Mrs Thatcher, the cabinet is really essential. And if a Prime Minister no longer has the confidence of the cabinet and they don't wish to be led by that Prime Minister anymore, then the Prime Minister is gone, which may therefore suggest that cabinet government does exist in the UK and the cabinet does play an important role in politics and in government.